story about. That's okay.
So sorry.
So to understand the context of this tragic event that happened, you also have to know that Nebraska of the 1870s and 80s was an unforgiving place. Some might even argue today that it still is an unforgiving place. But it was a place where ranchers, farmers, businessmen, those early settlers had major challenges every day just to survive. And for those people who came here beginning in the 1840s and through the 1870s when the Cozads got here, that was certainly the case. Between 1873 and 1876, and that's right around the time that Cozad is being developed, there's a terrible plague of grasshoppers. It's 110 miles wide and 1,000 miles long, this cloud of grasshoppers coming through. They ate everything, anything that was green. They ate leather, they ate fence posts, they ate broom handles, they landed on railroad tracks and stopped trains because they were like grease on the rails. But it's also a place of great violence. It's a challenging place, lots of guns, saloons, houses of prostitution, gambling. And as a great example in this story, many of you may know, in 1878, two homesteaders up near Callaway are accused of stealing cattle. They are lynched or shot and killed and then lynched on a tree there out of Callaway, and their bodies were burned as they hung there. It was a horrific incident that made national newspapers. And if you want to get a visual of what this time was like, you probably all heard about that series Yellowstone that's been on cable television. There's another show that goes with that called 1883. And I was watching the first couple episodes that are set in Texas, but those first couple episodes could have been Cozad in 1883 when this event happened we're going to talk about. So the two antagonists here, Alf Pearson and John Cozad, very different, but in some ways very similar. We'll start with Alf first. He's on the left. This is, I think, the only known picture I have seen of him. He is a hardworking rancher. He lives north of Cozad a couple miles. He's born in 1832, which means that on the day that the shooting occurred, he was 50 years old. He was originally from Indiana, and he was the son of a Quaker farmer, which strikes me as such a curious thing given the way that he died. And he was one of 7 children. Married Rachel Harriet Leonard, who was a Presbyterian in 1852, so he was just 30 years or 20 years old. And since he had married outside of his faith tradition, he had to leave the Quaker faith behind. Together, he and his wife, Harriet, had 6 children. There was William, Malin, Albert, Ora, May, and Francis. And it's believed that Alf Pearson came here to Dawson County sometime between 1871 and 1874. So he is coming here at the same time that John Cozad is coming here in 1872-73. The rest of his family, he came by himself, the rest of his family came in 1877 and 78. And William, his oldest son, was married by that point, and they arrived about the same time that the rest of the family did. The remaining members of his family, his parents and siblings, all remained in Indiana. So because of the high price of land in Indiana at the time, Pearson decided to homestead here. And he built a 3-room sod house in 1880 after an earlier house that he had lived in burned to the ground. And the records of that time show that he had 80 acres. He had a 14 by 39 foot sod house. He had a windmill and pump, a granary, a hog pen, and a chicken coop. And on his farm, he had planted 100 trees in addition to his fruit trees. He was appointed the county's special constable, deputy sheriff, and the first recorded action that was taken by him was done in July of 1874. I suspect, I can't prove this, but this is my own hunch, that probably like many area residents, Alf Pearson over time tired of John Cozad and his haughty manner. And he also, during this time between his becoming a constable and his being shot to death, he tangled with the Cozads and their relatives a number of times. Either arrested them, had to get them to court. So there were several altercations, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that they were not the best of friends when this all happened. So that's what we know about Alfred Pearson. And as I say, this is the only picture I could find of him, but you can see he's a pretty tough, lean-looking guy, I think, at least that's my picture of it. And then we have John Cozad. John Cozad was born in 1830, so he's 52 years old at the time of the shooting. He married Teresa Gatewood. She was 7 years younger than he was. They lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, and then moved when they created a town called Cozaddale in Cozaddale, Ohio, which is north and west of Cincinnati. They are the parents of two boys who reach adulthood, Johnny, as he was known here, Cozad, and Robert Henri Cozad. And both would become prominent in the fields that they chose, Johnny becoming a doctor, and of course, Robert becoming an artist. Teresa also had 3 other children who all died very young. John Cozad is a complicated person. I'm working on a book about this whole Nebraska business right now. And one of the things that strikes me is some days I wake up and I say, John Cozad's a rotten guy. And then there's other days when I get up and I say, what a visionary this guy was. I mean, to do some of the things that he did over the course of his lifetime, he's an interesting fellow. But there are all these, as there are with everyone, besides to his personality. He's considered by some to be loving, others by being haughty. Others say that he has a violent temper. Some say he's arrogant. Some say generous, a leader, a professional card player or gambler. He's a husband. He's selfish. He's cruel. Pro-Pearson folks will say he was an assassin or a killer. He was a loner, and to others, he was a close friend. To his friends and relatives, particularly the ones that he came here to Nebraska with, he was faithful and would remain friends even after he had left. In the record books at the museum and various books that have been written about this time period, one can find stories representing all those different sides of his personality. And if you're wanting to read a good book about this, Mary Sandoz's Son of the Gambling Man, it's probably the best book we would say. As a gambler, very successful. One time in a trip, as he was coming out here in Omaha, he gambled and made $50,000 in 3 draws of a game called Faro. If that was converted to today's dollars, that would be $1 million. He went to Denver in 1881. In 3 deals of Faro, made $9,000. So you can see that's what he was good at. He could read cards, he could read you, he could remember what cards you had. And I think after a few hands, as the stakes got higher, he could tell from looking at you whether you were, had a good hand, didn't have a good hand. That old song about knowing them or holding them and knowing when to hold them and fold them. That's exactly what John Cozad was. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe him as a very, very wealthy man. He was an ambitious man, and those ambitions would drive him to create two communities, Cozad Dale in Ohio and Cozad here, a real estate empire in Atlantic City, New Jersey after he left here, and then also an empire of land over in Denver where he also owned a mine somewhere down towards Colorado Springs. He was 6 feet high. He weighed about 185 pounds. He had jet black hair, piercing eyes. I think you can see that in that picture. He always was in vigorous health. He was a meticulous dresser for his day. And particularly when you think about the homesteaders around him who could probably barely afford shoes, this was a man who had what was called a Prince Albert jacket with the tails on the back of it. He wore a gold watch, a diamond stick pin, and then a gold-headed cane. That was the person people here in Cozad would have seen. He had a clear voice, did not talk much. He was decisive, he was aloof, and never really had conversations with people in that sense. At the museum, our tradition has been to always describe him as Mr. Cozad, because that's what he was known as. He was not a person that you would have walked up and said, John, how are you? You've been Mr. Cozad, how are you? His wife, very much a lady for her time, beautifully dressed, the daughter of a couple who had operated a hotel in Virginia. She must have certainly been disappointed when she got here to the Great Plains of Nebraska from that beautiful part of Virginia. Beautiful lady, beautifully dressed, and was very sensitive to the fine arts. One of the most notable acts of Cozad's generosity came as a result that those immigrants that were coming here faced in those first 3 or 4 years of arriving in Nebraska. And what happened was you have the grasshoppers, you have the crops being eaten or burned out in prairie fires. And Cozad knew that he had to build a bridge across the Platte River. At that point, Plum Creek, or what's now Lexington, is the only community along the Platte that has a bridge across it. So all the Republican Valley business, which goes quite a bit south of here, all that went to Plum Creek. And so Plum Creek became very soon the major leader in the area's economy. And what John Cozad, because of his personality, his haughtiness, had tried to get Dawson County to build a bridge. They would not. He was outnumbered. He was never on the county commissioners, never had a connection to that. And so he decided to build a bridge across the Platte with his own money. And today there are still these pilings left, some of which may date back from that Cozad project of trying to build this bridge across the Platte. And in 1875, John Cozad began to build the bridge, paying his own way, because the county was not going to fund it. Union Pacific fought him. They were not going to pay for it in terms of taxes. And so the bridge was started. And one of the things that John Cozad tried to do, because he saw this as being good for the entire length of the Platte River, was he wanted to narrow the river. So he made abutments that closed the river down so the water came underneath in a much narrower area. And he thought that might work for the length of the entire Platte River. So he did that. He had these pilings in the ground. They would have built a wooden bridge across it that would have been almost a mile long. And today you can, as I say, if you go down on Highway 21, you look to your left as you go over the Platte, you'll see some of those pilings still there. If this had happened, if the bridge had been finished, it would have had a major benefit to John Cozad, because most of his land holdings were south of the Platte River. I mean, he owned a considerable ground here in what became Cozad, but he owned a lot of grassland down on the south side of the Platte. And that also was where a lot of settlers were coming. And at that moment, they were going to Plum Creek to get their goods. And what Cozad was trying to do was to get them to come here. And initially they tried, even another person tried to have a flatboat or a raft go across the river, but that didn't work. There was quicksand along the river, so that one had to be careful of. I was walking along the river one night and I thought to myself, this is not a good idea because like this might be quicksand that I'm walking on. So, but anyway, and horses were reluctant to cross the river for the same reason I was reluctant to walk along it as well. They were afraid of the quicksand too, I suppose. And so Cozad begins its construction and it goes, we think, until 1880 or 1881. And he spent thousands and thousands of dollars. He had 20 teams of men working on this. They all had to be from Cozad or Cozad Freezing. And they had a pile driver that put those piles into the river, but the river was not to be tamed easily. And in 1878, after about 3 or 4 years of work, the bridge, that whole abutment washed away and they had to start over again. And so the pilings that are there now remain from that time, but Alf Pearson, it's said, worked on that project. And so keep that in the back of your mind because this is going to be one of the issues that come along later. Of course, there was from the very beginning this controversy between the ranchers and the homesteaders. That's what happened in Callaway. And you also have even John Cozad himself tangles with the Print Olive gang on his property. They shoot at Robert, they shoot at his dog. And so there are these not quite violent altercations, but threats of violence. And one of the arguments about what happened with Pearson and Cozad is that Pearson and Cozad had a dispute over grazing rights. And one of the things that I have not done, but I'd love to find out, is if Pearson and Cozad owned adjoining lands. And I wondered if maybe Pearson's cattle came onto Cozad's land by accident or purposely, or if that was maybe where this might have happened. So that's the second kind of flashpoint between the two men. So just a block west of the museum, Julia Gatewood, Teresa Gatewood's mother, owns a store called the Beehive, and it's circled there. You can see that it's a wood frame building. The city then, and this picture's from a little bit later because the building on the corner there was built in 1906, but the city then was mainly made up of wood frame buildings. Today it's almost all brick buildings, but it was not in those times. And it was a typical Western frontier town. But that's where the whole course of this event will take place. In 1881, the Cozads moved to Denver. It's for a host of reasons. One is that John Cozad, on 40,000 acres, had never paid any taxes on his property. That made a lot of people angry. Homesteaders who suffered to pay their $20 of taxes a year. And here's a guy who says he's the wealthiest guy in Dawson County, doesn't pay any taxes and owes thousands of dollars to Dawson County. And people do not like that for obviously the right reasons. And so he decides to move to Denver in the spring of 1881. And at the same time, people kind of rise up and get the name of the town changed from Cozad to Gould, named for Jay Gould, who was the owner, the president of the Union Pacific, but also president of the Erie Railroad back east. In October 1882, John Cozad comes back to Cozad from Denver to take care of business here in town. Alf Pearson, whose farm or ranch is just north a couple miles on town, he hears that Cozad is back in town. And he comes into town, and when you read the contemporary newspaper accounts, it's clear that he's got business with Cozad, and he's an angry person. And we know this because 12 years after the shooting, and I hate to skip ahead like this, but there's a grand jury that's held in 1894, and there are five witnesses, and 2 or 3 maybe were pro Cozad, and 2 or 3 were pro Pearson, and they each give almost identical testimony as to what happened. And they had met to resolve the case with John Cozad, and he was gone. Remember, he, as you'll find out in just a minute, is left. But it's worth mentioning because we know a lot about what happened on that day at the Beehive from that testimony. And so one of the 5 people that testified at that grand jury was Julia Gatewood. And she could remember clearly that John Cozad, her son-in-law, was in her store, and Alf Pearson walked in, and they began talking, and then all of a sudden it got very loud and noisy, and John Cozad said, "You can't speak like that. There's a woman present," meaning his mother. And so Pearson says something like, "I didn't know she was here," and they walk out together onto the front porch of that building. And when they get out, when Cozad gets out onto the porch, Alf Pearson hits him square in the face and knocks him over. And all of a sudden, there's this racket that Julia Gatewood hears. And John Cozad now is kind of, as you'll see in the next slide, is kind of stuck now in the shipping box. And when Alf Pearson hit him, he fell into the box. And if you can imagine, his butt is at the bottom of the box, his legs are sticking out one end, his shoulder and arms are sticking out the other end. And Alf Pearson is really just beating the crap out of John Cozad. John Cozad holds up a hand to ward off the blows, trying to Pearson to quit. And finally, Pearson grabbed John Cozad by the collar. And at that moment, John Cozad pulled out a pistol and shot Alf Pearson in the face. And this is what this picture, you can see what happened. So Alf Pearson now is shot and falls back. Mr. Pearson or Mr. Drew grabs him to stop him from falling. And all of a sudden there's a commotion around the store with all these people wanting to see what had happened. John Cozad is pulled out of the box. He's bloodied. He's got a lot of scratches on his face. His nose is really badly off. And Julia Gatewood now comes out and says to him, we've got to do this to get your cleaned up. The white shirt was all bloody. And she was able to staunch all the bleeding, and she put something called court plaster on his wounds. And after about a half an hour, John Cozad left her in the house in the Beehive without saying a word to her. And all of this is relayed in the deposit or in the grand jury testimony. For John Cozad, he knew, because the Callaway story had only happened 2 years before. So there was, this kind of remembrance of what had happened to those 2 homesteaders. And so John Cozad knew that because he was not a popular person, that he could well be lynched right then and there. And everybody said, let's wait till the sheriff gets here, he'll protect you and all that. But John Cozad knew that, of what could happen. And so this all happened on October 14th, 1882. The sheriff, who everybody said he should wait for, did not get here to Cozad until that evening. And John Cozad was already gone by that point. And at that point, when the sheriff gets here, Cozad is gone, he issues an arrest warrant for the arrest of John Cozad. And it's at this point that the story gets murky. And it's a story that fascinates me. And I have to say that all the biographers of Robert Henri, by way of John Cozad, believed that he went to Denver. And I don't. Contrarian, all these historians are contrarians, you know. And you'll see why in just in a couple minutes. But there are several ways that he could have gotten out of it. Certainly, he could have gone on the Union Pacific east or west, or he could have gone 50 miles to the south and got on the Burlington, Missouri railroad and gone east or west. There are some beliefs that he walked halfway down going towards Kansas and that some farmer picked him up in a wagon. There's another story about him taking off his hat and stuffing it in a gopher hole. There's another account of him borrowing a horse from David Claypool and riding to Kansas. And at that moment, the trail kind of goes cold, if you will. And as I say, William Homer and Bernard Pearlman both believe that he went to Denver, met his wife. They came up with a plan to deal with him getting out and disappearing, and that then John Cozad disappeared. And some of them have even argued that he stayed in Colorado and felt safe enough to stay there. But these are the possible routes that he could have gone. There, you can see where Denver is. I believe that he went east, and I think he either went to Chicago or New York. Some have even argued that he went back to Cozadville. And there was somebody from Cozad that went there to Cozadville years ago, and they were talking to an older gentleman there who had known, his father had known John Cozad. And he believed that John Cozad was hiding out in the house that they built in Cozad when sheriffs from Nebraska showed up to arrest him. But I can't prove that or disprove that story, but that's one of the endings. So, whoops. But the reason I don't believe this story is that in 1932, so this is now 50 years after the event, a nephew of John Cozad, Robert Gates, who had gone east and met John Cozad in New York City when he was kind of under the new name and new alias, talked to him about this whole business. And John Cozad never mentioned having gone to Denver, just said that he disappeared for 7 months. And that the communications that John Cozad had to keep in touch with Teresa and Johnny and Robert were done through Traver Gate, his brother. So those are the ways that John Cozad could have gone. One of the things then that happened, and this really turned the whole case around, was that Alfred Pearson dies 3 weeks later on November 4th, 1882, 1 month after John Cozad had shot him. And that all of a sudden changes the game, because now John Cozad is faced with a murder charge and not just with a shooting charge. And he passed away near his home quietly, without struggle. He had a doctor there, Dr. Bancroft, who took care of him. And then after that, he was buried in the Reinhardt Cemetery, which is just off of Route 4, I think it is 424. It's about a mile in from there, the cemetery. His funeral was conducted by the Reverend C.S. Carr of the Cozad Methodist Episcopal Church. His estate was worth $1,100, and many of the remaining items in that estate were purchased by the children at auction. And the homestead was ultimately sold by his wife Harriet 6 years later in 1888. About a month after Pearson's death, an inquest jury is convened. They meet in now Lexington, and Dr. Bancroft reports that John Cozad's shot is indeed what had done Pearson in. I might also argue, you might say, that there has been some argument over the years that if Cozad had really killed Pearson, he would have died that day. But he went on for 3 weeks. And so the argument was that maybe he didn't get good medical care. Maybe it had nothing to do with John Cozad. So that's another piece of the argument. 2 weeks later, the governor of Nebraska offers a reward for the arrest and conviction of John Cozad, and that's all that he could offer. That was the maximum amount legally that he could offer. And so, if John Cozad was indeed in Colorado, as the biographers suggest, he certainly would have had to have disappeared by that point because he could have been arrested very easily. But as I say, I don't think that's what happens. And the reason I don't is that Johnny Cozad, just 3 weeks after the death of Alfred Pearson, gets involved in an episode that shows, to me at least, why that did not happen. So Johnny, as he's known, goes to Lexington or Plum Creek, stays at the Johnson House, which I think is number 8 or 9 in that graphic, and stays there overnight, leaves on the 11 o'clock train next day, and stops here in Cozad, and then gets on the train and continues on to Colorado. He had left, it was alleged, a firebomb in the Johnson Hotel under a bed, under a feather bed, that had this long fuse, and it would have taken an hour for it to burn into the big bottle of kerosene. And had it caught fire, it would have burned all of Lexington down, or Plum Creek down, because it was a very windy day when this happened. And so all those buildings, which you could see are all right next to each other, all wood frame buildings, would have been gone. Immediately, the owner of the Johnson House, that was the name of the place, files charges when he goes up the next morning and smells this kerosene and walks around and goes into that room, notices that a lamp in the hallway has kerosene in it is empty, and finds all that kerosene sprinkled on the floor and under the bed. And so he files charges, and so an arrest warrant is put out for Johnny. Now, Johnny is in Greeley, Colorado at that point, and as he's going west on the Union Pacific Railroad, the conductor starts looking for him. Well, he's in the John, closes the door, and stays there for 2 or 3 hours. But at any rate, once he gets to Greeley, he's arrested when somebody recognizes him when he comes off the train. And I mention that because that was only a couple hours after he had been charged, or when the charge had been made. And Johnny was not anywhere near as well known as John Cozad would have been to the Union Pacific or to anybody. So as he was known, it became known as the firebug of Plum Creek, the bail was established for $5,500 for him. And he sat in jail until the following March because Teresa Cozad could not raise the money because her husband is gone and could not raise the bail to do that. And finally, in February of 1883, now this is almost 6 months later, Johnny Cozad is released because Teresa Cozad and a bunch of other people pledged their assets for $25,000 to get him out of jail. His attorney, C.W. McNamara, is one of the people who pledges his assets of $5,000. And after this was all over with, he never got his money back. So he had to pay the court the bail because it would have been violated. In 1885, a default against Johnny is filed. In 1888, the state of Nebraska files a claim against Teresa Cozad and Julia Gatewood, Johnny Cozad, to get this bail money back. But McNamara is the one who they can get a hold of, so they get him. But all of this is just to show you how quickly Johnny Cozad was arrested, within hours, really, after. And that's what I think would have happened to John Cozad if he had known. It would have been the same kind of situation because people would have known who he was. He was prominent, founder of the town, and so on. So this is just this newspaper clip here, but here it is that he's in the county Bastille. And as I said, it was, and again, this is why this story of Pearson and Cozad gets so muddied, because in the case of Johnny Cozad, it has long been said that he burned that building down. And that's not what happened. But because the charges were filed by the owner and said that he had burned the building, which did not happen, that story has come down. And in Mary Sandoz's book, it's in there as well. So, however that worked, and I'm of the belief that John Cozad is now sitting in New York or in Chicago. And so then Teresa and Robert leave here in 1884. We're pretty certain of that because that's when the property was closed, when the hotel was sold. And also we have several pieces of artwork or copies of artwork that Robert drew in 1883 and dated them. So we know that he's here at certain times. They go to Atlantic City, then begin a whole other real estate empire. And it became known, as you can see, there's Lee's Pavilion. Their names were changed. John Cozad became Richard Lee. Teresa Cozad became Tess Lee. Johnny Cozad became Frank Southern without an E, a weird spelling. And Robert Henri Cozad became Robert Earl Penrod. And he later dropped the Earl. So good was this identity change that when Frank Southern got a passport in the decades to come, he listed his birthplace as Mexico, even though he was born in Cincinnati. Robert Henri stayed true to form, though. He said he was born in Cincinnati. So this is where the family winds up for 10 or 15 years. They make another fortune here, also filled with controversy. Frank Southern serves on the Atlantic City town board for 3 years. But John Cozad, or now Richard Lee, got in trouble with the town of Atlantic City. You would have thought he wanted to keep kind of a low profile because of his own problems back in Nebraska. He carried 6 shooters, wore a cowboy hat, and walked along the boardwalk that way. Put 2 things that looked like cannons at either end of the pavilion there, and you would have never known that he was a fugitive from justice, to be sure. The next piece of the Pearson-Cozad story, and I just don't believe this was a coincidence, but it may well be. Harriet Pearson, Al Pearson's wife, dies on January 14th, 1894. And that may not mean anything to you at the moment. John Cozad has not come back. Teresa, no one of the Cozad family has come back yet at that point. But Harriet Pearson dies. And I believe that what happened is when she died, it gave Traber Gatewood, this would be Teresa Gatewood's brother, the opportunity to appeal to the Dawson County Court to get the charges dropped, have a grand jury meet, and and essentially free the Cozads from this legal bind that they were in. She's buried next to Al in the Reinhardt Cemetery. If it is not a curious coincidence, I don't know how much one would be, because just 5 months later, on May 9th, 1894, a grand jury meets in Lexington and Dawson County to dismiss the charges against John Cozad. And as I said earlier, they drew from 5 or 6 people in that to the grand jury who had been witness to the events, and Julia Gatewood being one of them. Dr. William Bancroft, the physician who had attended Pearson, H. Sinclair, a person who had visited Pearson, Oliver Buckley, who had been with Pearson. So there were 3, I would say, pro-Pearsons and 3 pro-Cozads, and they all said almost identically the same story. It's not like each of them had a different story, and you'd say, well, I can't see how that matches with that. So in the last weeks of April, these depositions are taken. Sam Schooley notarizes, a friend of Cozad, notarizes all of the pro-Cozad side. And so finally, the judge drops the charges, both against Cozad for the murder of Al Pearson, but also the charges against the firebug at the Castile in Dawson County. So both of those men now have completely clean records after this has happened. Several months later, John Cozad, for the first time, comes back here since he had left in 1882. And there are several accounts of when this trip happened. Some have said it was July, but I think it was actually in November of 1894. And the reason that we know that is that he was signing, as you'll see in just a moment, signing deeds that were dated from November of 1894. But the Cozad that John Cozad came back to was a very different town. There were many houses, there were hundreds of people living here now. The farm economy had done very well in those decade or so afterwards. Irrigation had been brought to Dawson County. Curiously, in 1894, there had been such a drought that year that they realized they had to do something. So all these irrigation canals that you see now in our area here are all coming from this time period of 1894. And some of the people that were involved with the Cozad Irrigation Company were people that had been involved with John Cozad here. So Cozad has now been exonerated of the shooting or murder of Alfred Pearson. Johnny Cozad is free. And so when John Cozad comes back, and I have to just tell you that in 1884, when John Cozad and Teresa Cozad leave here, they sign a deed to Stephen Henry, and both John Cozad's signature and Teresa Cozad's signatures on it. How they got John Cozad's signature on there, if he was supposed to be disappeared in nowhere, I don't know. But I do know that David Claypool said that that's John Cozad's signature when he was called to be deposed at some other point. So John Cozad, for 19 properties here in Cozad, writes new deeds to the property he had already sold in 1884. And he says to these 19 people, just in case my lawsuit against Stephen Henry goes bad or goes good, you'll have a good deed. And one of them was Charles Allen, but we have 19 of these in our collection. And so he wasted very little time trying to get his fortune back here in Nebraska. And each of these contracts were either witnessed or signed with him by Sam Stool or Dave Claypool. You can see their names are on the right-hand side. Stephen Henry and his people that represent him here, he was from Illinois, they get wind of this and immediately take John Cozad to court. Now, because he was from Illinois and because John Cozad was saying he was from Iowa, of all places, they have to go to federal court to settle this because Stephen Henry didn't want John Cozad doing this with these titles that were not his to do. And so it goes to court. Teresa Cozad, David Claypool, John Cozad, Robert Cozad are all subpoenaed to show up in court to deal with this lawsuit. And as you can imagine, none of them show up. And so the judge rules that what will now happen is that every deed in Cozad that gets passed forward from that point has to have a paragraph in there that says that this land is owned by Stephen Henry. John Cozad has no right to it, and Stephen Henry is the only one who can pass this by going forward. If you have a house in Cozad, particularly the closer you get to the museum and to the south of the museum, that paragraph is on your deed, even with the state. So what I think really happened is that Stephen Henry was wealthier, smarter, and had better lawyers than John Cozad. I mean, Stephen Henry owned 8 granaries, owned a bank, owned a hotel back there in Bushnell, Illinois. And I just don't think I wondered if John Cozad just did this as a bluff to see maybe he'd get a few $1,000s out of it or get some of his land back. But at any rate, Judge Elmer Dundee fixed that, and that was it. And so, as I say, in every deed here in Cozad, just a few blocks north of the museum and just a few blocks south, has that clause in it. So you might say to me, well, so what? What does all that mean for Robert Henri, perhaps, or the Cozads? So this happens in 1894 and 95, court case. Imagine if you're Robert Henri. So in 1893, 94, 95, he is becoming an important artist. He's an instructor in Philadelphia and is teaching classes at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And what if a reporter showed up at the Omaha court, and when Robert Henri Cozad walked in and was deposed, the reporter says, geez, I just saw your artwork in Philadelphia, but you were Robert Henri. And so I am sure that for Robert Henri, he wanted to stay as far away from that court case as he could because of what the potential might have been to his reputation. For a long time at our museum, we said that when the Cozads left, they never came back again. And that Julia Gatewood never saw her daughter Teresa again. They cried. It was so sad, weeping, gnashing of teeth, all that sort of thing. That's not what happened. Actually, Julia Gatewood went to live with the Cozad, or with Robert Henri and his wives back in New York. And she even came back to Cozad a few times, as did Teresa Cozad, and as did Frank Southern, or Johnny Cozad. Johnny Cozad comes back a year after this all ends in 1895. He comes back with wife in tow, Jenny Jenks, who's related to a very wealthy and prominent Rhode Island family that makes textiles. She's a doctor in Philadelphia. He's a doctor in Philadelphia. She brings, and everybody wrote about this, she brings a $10,000 diamond necklace with her, probably to settle some of the problems of Julia Gatewood's debts. But they did not hide. They just rolled in and everybody said, oh, Johnny's in town. They called him Johnny. They didn't call him Frank. And then Teresa would come back on a number of occasions, and she went to Sam Schooley's house. This is right across the street from the Grand Generation Center. And that house was moved. Actually, it was down towards where the park is, the city park is now. But she sat on the front porch of that house. And that's where the school was. So it was not as if the Cozads never came back. There was no weeping and gnashing of teeth. The only one that we don't know about is Robert Henri. I have not been able to find anything, any hint of anything he ever passed through again. I do have one time in 1893 when he was on his way to Pikes Peak in Colorado, and he was coming from New York. So he had to take the Union Pacific out to Denver or the Burlington, Missouri, out to Colorado. But so he may have passed through, but there is no notice of him ever having come to state. So a lot of the pieces of this puzzle in terms of the architectural legacy have disappeared. The Beehive was replaced by the Stockman State Bank. And so that's gone. Julia and Robert Gatewood's house is down by the hospital. It's that really beautiful pink house. You know the house that I'm talking about. That's their house. It was moved up there. And of course, our museum still stands as well. And I know, I'm pretty certain that some of you came here tonight with the thought that you had your own story or what you thought had happened with Alfred Pearson and John Cozad. And we had recently someone write on our Facebook page that how could the museum honor John Cozad, who was an assassin? So Marlene wrote me and said, Peter, you got to do something about that, you know. And you know, you don't want to fight on Facebook. It's kind of a waste of time. But I deference to my boss, I said I better do that. So I wrote a long letter and I said, you know, we're doing a lot of research on this right And I think this story is more complicated than you think. We've been at the grand jury testimony, and I don't know that it's fair to call John Cozad an assassin. Maybe if you're a Pearson family member, you would feel that way. But here we are, more than 140 years, or after 140 years after that event, and probably some of you are going to walk out here and say, I still think that guy's all wrong. But that just shows you how this story continues. But when you read the newspaper accounts, most of the newspaper accounts, and you read the grand jury testimony, almost all of them agree. And the one thing that has kind of come more to light more recently was the notion that Al Pearson had a knife. And I don't know if Mary Sandoz writes this in her book. Now remember, she interviewed people in the 1930s here and in Lexington about this whole business. And she writes, and she's the first person, no newspaper, not grand jury, she's the first person that says Al Pearson had a knife and pulled it out. And I'm pretty sure it's in her book that she says Al Pearson grabs John Cozad by the collar and says, I'm going to cut your lying tongue out of your mouth. And that's when John Cozad shot him because he was afraid to lose his tongue. So I think that story, though, is 40 or 50 years after the event. So what we have been working on is all the contemporary evidence of that time. I think that as a historian, that's what you have to go to, not what people are saying now. And so you have stories like this that have appeared in the paper that have a certain take on what happened. But I think if you're true to history, as I am true to history, then you're going to look at as many primary sources and look at all of them. So that is my program. Oh, and one last thing is we're working, it's been a hard slog, but we're working on a book right now. It's at least 400 pages long that kind of tells all this that I told you tonight. Hopefully it'll be out later this year, early next, whatever. But we're kind of showing all this new information or information that just kind of got lost over the years or got buried in a file somewhere. But all of that will come out in the book for us. So thank you for having me tonight. And I will be glad to answer any questions if anybody has any questions, or perhaps has a different story that Al Pearson and I have. So. Any questions? Yes. Linda. Pharaoh. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Chuck, we talked about this.
Yeah,
do you remember?
yeah. So Pharaoh was a popular game at that time. And what you had was all 13 cards of one suit lying on the table. The numbers matter, not the suit. And then the dealer would have a 52 card deck. And then the players would stand around. I kind of say it's kind of like a game of roulette. Because what you would do is you would bet what the next card was going to be or what it's not going to be. So, and of course, where John Cozad would make his money would be he could memorize every card. It was said that he could, if there was one card left to play, he'd say, that time. So as you go through the deck, you're going to know what's gone, what's there. So at that point in time, he starts really up the bet because he knows there's a 75% chance of the next card. But Pharaoh isn't played anymore because casinos have figured out that the odds for the house are about even for the house players. And casinos don't like those odds. They like the odds where you give them money. That's the game of Pharaoh.
Thank you, Chuck. And he did play poker as well. But Pharaoh he was known as the Pharaoh King, actually. And we have a Pharaoh display there at the museum. But yeah, that's what it is. So, but the other thing that, as Chuck said, he could do was read cards, but he could also read you. And if you were holding a hand or you had the right card, you got those eyes that are saying, I got this one licked. And he knew that. He just had that ability to read her. And you saw those eyes in that picture that I showed. Anybody else? All right, I guess more I turn over. Oh, go ahead, Linda. I'm sorry.
Sure. Indian codes on the original farmland.
I think the building is gone, but the Reinhardt Cemetery is still there, and that's where he is. Well, go ahead, you,
Reinhardt Cemetery is about a quarter of a mile from my land,
okay.
and I'm about 12 miles from east.
Mhm.
And it's up on a high bluff,
Yes,
and it's on, well, it was on the Melody property now that's owned. by Henri. And usually we go up there in the summertime because it's high prairie black grass. Black grass.
Ah.
So not a lot of people visit it. I've been up there 2 or 3 times. Right now, I have the plaques from the grave sites because we wanted to stone it. And, he was my great grandfather.
okay. Okay.
And my aunt, who would have been his niece, would have been very upset with the story about Marie's hand. Because she said that was a lie.
And you know, that's
I
what has
suspect she
happened.
lived through that pretty much.
Yeah, sure. And that's part of what I was, when Laura asked me to do this, I said, you know, this is the one program, I'll do any program for you want. This is the one that I thought I was a little nervous about. I was talking to somebody tonight before I came over and they said, you know, if I don't hear back from you tomorrow, I'll know what happened to you. But I think that feeling that she, I think it's done it many people. When we were restoring the museum in the 1980s, there were members of the Pearson family who would not give money to that effort because of very sentiment. Yeah, right. So, you know, and we have the same problem with Miles Marriott, you know, because he shot the sheriff up in Oshkosh. And I had somebody say to me one time, I think they were serious, but they said, I can't believe that you honor 2 assassins here. Miles Marriott and John Cozad. Yeah.
My aunt was always very vehement about what happened, and I'm sure she was around.
Sure.
She
Mhm.
and she had all kinds of things. I got some in my grand jury.
Mhm.
And the interesting thing was that my great grandfather on my father's side was one of those people.
On the grand jury.
I
Yeah.
don't know whether he was both
Well, we have all the testimony. If you ever want to come down and see it, you can. Oh, yeah.
But the stories are very much alike. They don't differ.
No. And you know, when I read the grand jury, I thought I would find this knife business in the grand, and it's not. None of those 6 people mention a knife. It's not until Mary Sandoz mentions a knife that happened. And you know, one of the things, unfortunately, yeah, one of the things, unfortunately, I guess I do because I'm Cozad centric because of our museum, is not to talk so much about what happened in the aftermath to Alfred Pearson's. So, or his family, because of course he's gone. So the father, the breadwinner, the leader of the family is gone with all those kids, young kids. And the other thing is that they auctioned everything off and it came out to $1,000 or whatever it was. I do know, and I haven't been able to track this down, that the estate of Al Pearson went after the Cozads for more money. And when Stephen Henry sold the property, or I'm sorry, when he bought the property, Cozads, he cut of the 20,000, 5,000 in escrow, or forced the Cozads to hold out 5,000 because he was concerned about lawsuits and whatever hold that they might have on assets of Cozads. I do know that happened. I don't know how that was resolved, but of course, once the Cozads disappeared, Stephen Henry bought this property in February of 1884. He registers the deed immediately. And at that time, it was often registered a deed a year or 2 later. There's no rush. But on the same day, he was down at the courthouse registering the deed. And I think within 10 years, as I've said, he was into trouble with the courts over Cozad. When the original contract between Stephen Henry was signed, it was between him, Teresa Cozad, and Robert Cozad, who was acting as her attorney back. And so Henry must have said, I'm not going to do that. Where's John Cozad's signature? his name's on the deed. And then all of a sudden, miraculously, this deed appears, and John Cozad's name is on it. David Claypool says that's John Cozad's signature, and then it was all settled. But I think it all happened very quickly, and maybe it was because of this business of trying to forestall the Pearsons. And I've also wondered, I don't believe it's a coincidence that they tried to get Cozad exonerated after she died, married. It's within months, and it's right the first court session right after she dies that they go to court. And I don't know if they were worried about sensibilities or if they were worried about whatever. Maybe the kids didn't have the resources to sue the Cozad or keep that alive if they were gone. But whatever happened, it all happened after she died. There's just there's more to that than I think this my opinion.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
One of the other things I also work at, I think that had something to do with this. Anyway, I had to go through the record of the old dusty ones, great big thick books, handwritten and beautiful handwriting. But they listed Pearson and his wife as members of that church. And then, in an aside, they were excommunicated because he owned it.
Oh, interesting. Plot thickens, huh?
It was always fascinating to me about this. My aunt was very active, and she, everybody's speaking.
Sure.
And the other thing is among some of the things I had was that the young
Robert Cozad.
Was dubbed in arsonist by some people. And at one point, they said he burned down the entire city of Cozad. He said like half a dozen houses, but no, they didn't go on to say.
Well, Johnny,
on an illegal act.
in 1876, what was the community or hamlet of Cozad. Now that would have been all around where the train station is today. That's where the original neighborhood was. All those buildings burned to the ground. And in one of the buildings, there was a lawyer who burned to death, sleeping or drinking or whatever. Anyway, when this happened over in Plum Creek, somebody said, "Don't you remember that fire in Cozad?" And this kid, Johnny Cozad, is probably the one who set that fire. And Mary Sandoz says that in her book as well. But that was in the newspaper accounts at that time, is that he, being Johnny Cozad, was no, because well, so he leaves. He goes to Colorado. Then after he's let out on bail, and then when his court date comes up, he said he was sick and he couldn't get there. And then all of a sudden he disappears. And Teresa Cozad was given an envelope that said for Johnny on it. She had no idea where it came from, how it got there. And that was his train ticket to get out of Colorado east. So this happens with Pearson in 1882. By the fall of 1883, following year, all of their Colorado properties have been sold. And by that point, almost all of their Cozad de Alfaro properties sold. And by the spring of 84, all of their properties here sold. And John Cozad had to sign every one of those deeds because otherwise they wouldn't have been valid. Somebody could have sued. But one of the things we've been trying to do in this effort is to clarify some of this. And the family, the Pearson family, would be absolutely justified in saying it ruined their lives. I absolutely agree with it. I don't maybe make as much of a point of it, but they're absolutely right, because all of a sudden the family breadwinner, who is also a deputy sheriff, so he's a respected person in the community. I like the fact that he was a Quaker. I'm not a Quaker myself, but I know Quakers, and I just think that's a pretty interesting thing. And here he was a sheriff carrying a gun, because most Quakers are pacifists and won't do that, or at least ones from way
I'm
back
sure he
then.
had to leave that.
He did. He did have to give it up. Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you for your comments. I appreciate that. Good to hear from you. Anybody else? And if not, then we'll see you in March.
Do you want to give a brief synopsis on the next two
Oh, sure,
series that are
sure.
coming up?
So the one in March about silent cities, graveyards, churchyards, and cemeteries. I'll just tell you this for the record. People say, oh, it's a gross topic. It's morbid. I'm not interested in stuff like that. So I was a speaker a few years ago at a historical society in New Jersey the week before Thanksgiving. And I said to that historical society, you're gonna have 150 people. Ah, what do you? So I said, okay, so 25 people showed up. They had 25 chairs. They were gone, 50 gone, 75 chairs. Fine, it was standing room only. But anyway, it's one of my most popular programs I do because people are really fascinated. And back east, there is more of a diversity of cemeteries and graveyards than there is here in Nebraska, because mainly everything here is after the 1860s. But back east, I mean, I helped restore a cemetery that was from the late 1600s, early 1700s. And so, and we'll have slides of all those just to show you, because today, if you go to that cemetery, or even our cemetery in Cozad, but the one east of Lexington, they're all in straight rows and they all follow the roads. And if you were to ask me about that 1600 cemetery, they're in straight rows, but they're all following an east-west configuration, because at that time, when people were buried, they presumed they would be rising towards the eastern sun. So your footstone and your headstone are in an east-west configuration. So that's the kind of stuff we'll be talking about. And this picture is from the cemetery where Sleepy Hollow in Concord, Mass. That's where Henri David Thoreau and all those guys of that group are buried. So anyhow, that's what that one will be. And then on the next one on April, we'll be reading from the journals of Lewis and Clark. And I should tell you that, let's see, in 2008, I took a leave of absence from or sabbatical from my job and went for 4 months following the trail of Lewis and Clark from the Atlantic to the Pacific back. And every day when I was traveling, I would stop at a place maybe where they camped, some places they had seen, and would read from the journals of that place. So that's how that program is. And they're each about 45 minutes to an hour. And that's a slide program.
That's it.
Okay. All right. Thanks for coming, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.